Put your hands behind your back. Raina Cole glanced up, her voice cold as a razor across the skin. Cuff me one more time, and my husband will turn your trashy precinct into a Delta Force training target. But the two officers still gripped her like she was a junkie, unaware they had just turned themselves into live tactical practice. This isn't a case of wrong person. This is pulling the trigger on the woman of someone who doesn't need permission to eliminate. What state are you in? In yours. Are the cops smart enough to tell the difference between a victim and a warning shot? The sunlight was still warm, but power had turned cold. Raina Cole stepped slowly out of the olive SUV, holding a bundle of white tulips, still wet with dew. The collar of her blue dress stirred slightly in the wind, her posture straight like a spine that had never learned to bend. She shut the car door, eyes flicking past the arching trees dotted with patches of broken sunlight, and moved toward the front steps of the house. One hand held the keys, the other the flowers, her smile light like an old habit, the kind worn by someone who'd survived more kinds of weather than the weather itself. Inside, the lamp by the window cast a glow onto the glass, reflecting her silhouette as she neared what should have been an inviolable boundary, the roof of her own home. The screech of tires sliced through the quiet like a blade across oil paint. A patrol car swerved the wrong way, braking hard at the edge of her driveway, wheels tilted, leaving two black streaks across the concrete. The door flung open before the engine stopped, and two figures jumped out without signal, without greeting. Both wore police uniforms, sidearms clearly visible, radio cords still catching static. The first was broad-shouldered, with patchy gray stubble and bloodshot eyes twitching like they were ready to detonate. That was Officer Dax Harper. The second, younger, jaw clenched off-center, skin-taut Luke Brenner. Hands where I can see them. Don't play cute. Brenner's voice cracked out like a command loosed from the throat of an impatient predator. Raina stopped moving, half from survival instinct, half from curiosity. She didn't flinch, just glanced at the tulips in her hand, then looked up, head tilted slightly as if checking for seriousness in their eyes. Harper squinted, gun still holstered but his hand already on the grip, ready to turn threat into action in less than a second. Raina leaned slightly, her tone calm to the point of dangerous. You're pointing a gun at a woman holding tulips. Not a plea, not an explanation, just a blunt statement, hitting the absurdity of the moment like a quiet slap. Harper snapped. Tulips don't prove innocence. Step back and shut up. No question about her identity, no request for ID, just pure force and bias shaped by skin tone, posture, and a gaze that didn't bow. She barely had time to take half a step when Brenner lunged, yanked the flowers from her hand, and flung them to the ground. Petals burst apart like rejected evidence under the slanting afternoon light. What's in the bag? He growled, each word tight, his other hand pulling cuffs from his belt, like someone trained to bind first, justify later. Raina didn't move. No retreat, no advance. I just got home, she said, eyes tracking every motion. And unless it's illegal to be black and bring flowers to your own porch, I suggest you explain yourself. The air went still. Brenner locked his jaw. Harper stepped closer. You matched a description, he panted. Female suspect, possible impersonator, property fraud. Raina raised an eyebrow. And you got that off a tulip? Harper suddenly stepped close, his breath thick with old coffee and abused authority. You look like you're about to say something clever. Don't, it'll just make it worse. Raina gave a faint smile, light as a blade slipping across the tongue. Worse than kidnapping a homeowner on camera in broad daylight? The patrol car's ventilation hissed behind her, blending into an air that crackled like loose wires. Brenner grabbed her arm and squeezed hard. Put your damn hands behind your back, now, he barked. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She looked straight ahead. You touch me again, and my husband will shut this entire precinct down, Raina hissed, blood rushing to her ears. Harper laughed. Oh, sweetheart, is he gonna sue us with his LinkedIn account? Brenner yanked her arms back, hard enough for her shoulder to crack. Raina twisted with the force, but didn't lose balance, didn't look away from Harper's face. He's not a lawyer, she panted. He commands the kind of men who don't need court orders, just coordinates. Ah, no. The cuffs clicked shut like the sound of another safety catch locking down on her life. Her house key slipped from her fingers, landing among crushed tulips beneath a boot. Two neighbors, 3 doors down, began pulling their curtains closed. A young girl who had been skipping rope in her yard stopped and stepped back. Harper grabbed Raina's hair and dragged her toward the car, while Brenner opened the back door. She kept her head up. "I live here," she said one last time before being shoved into the back seat. Harper leaned in, voice low like a slap to her pride. "Then you should have smiled when we asked." The door slammed shut, reflecting Brenner's smug grin through the tinted glass. They pulled away, leaving behind a shredded bouquet, a gate half open, and a silence heavy as a prophecy ignored. Raina closed her eyes. Her head tapped lightly against the seat, not from pain, but because she knew something bigger than her, deeper than law, and faster than the system, had just started to wake up, and it was very, very angry. The language of power doesn't need reason. It needs knees and submission. The patrol car hadn't even cleared the driveway when the right door swung open. Brenner stepped out first, still gripping the cuffs like a prop meant more for show than control. Harper followed close behind, eyes darting to the corner security camera, then pretending it wasn't there. They pulled Raina from the back seat almost like hauling a corpse, twisting her arms behind her, pressing weight into her shoulders and neck as if escorting an active shooter. But this was a sidewalk, in the middle of a pristine white neighborhood, the hedges trimmed like a quiet reminder of who maintains peace here, and for whom. Raina backed up step by step, but her legs still fought for balance, refusing to be dragged like dead weight. "Do you have a warrant?" she snapped, forcing each word out like an effort to reset a legal order already slipping off its rails. "I live here. I have ID inside. You can call dispatch. Run my name," Harper scoffed, shaking his head with a performance-weary smirk. "Criminals say that too." Usually louder. His hand pushed down on her shoulder from behind, pinning her against the iron fence warming under the late sun. An old woman trimming her lawn across the street paused, squinting over, but when Harper looked her way, the light in her eyes shut off. She turned back, closed her door, and drew the curtain. On this street, everyone knew silence kept you alive. Brenner yanked Raina's arms lower, her joints starting to grind in protest, but he leaned in and whispered, "Say another word and you'll eat pavement." That line was the final knock before violence walked in. Raina didn't scream. She didn't beg. She turned just enough for her eyes to cut across Brenner's temple and spoke with a voice cold as steel soaked in frost. "You lay a hand on me again, and my husband will ruin you." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a bluff. It was a reminder that he was about to touch something capable of burying his entire career in a report that would never be made public. Brenner stepped half a pace back, but Harper burst out laughing like Raina had just told the last joke of the day. "Is that a threat from a housewife in heels?" he sneered, not bothering to hide his contempt. Then, without another word, he shoved her shoulder down, forced her head to the ground, knee in her back, arms yanked tight behind her like he was restraining a wild animal. She twisted to dodge the knee, but still hit the cracked pavement. Her knees folded, her dress ridden up her thighs, the back of her blouse dusty, her hair stuck to her neck. No one asked if she was hurt. No one handed her a towel. A small beep came from the security camera above the porch, but Harper blocked it with his body. Brenner nudged one of her legs with his boot, checking for resistance, then unlocked and snapped the cuffs tighter around her wrist bones. "Still think you're married to the president of Earth?" he asked, lips curled like the fight was already won. Raina clenched her teeth and stayed silent, not from fear, but because she knew one more word would be enough to turn their ego into a fire worthy of termination. A child on a scooter 2 houses down had stopped, pulled out a phone, and started filming. Her voice trembled. "She's not doing anything. They're hurting her." But no one stopped. Brenner dragged Raina up. Harper kept her head down, hissing quiet insults not loud enough to hear clearly, but heavy enough to carry every bias his body had ever stored. As they crossed the iron fence and pushed Raina toward the car, a middle-aged white man appeared at the far end of the street. He wore a blue button-down, holding a paper bag, fresh from shopping. He saw the scene, quickened his pace, mouth parting as if to speak, but then froze when Harper's gaze swept over him. He changed direction, turned back the other way, head down. Raina could still hear his breathing, the sound of shame when an adult chooses not to be a witness. The car door opened. Harper placed a hand on Raina's head, ready to shove her inside, but she turned her face, not in defiance, but with a question sharp enough to hit the spine. "What happens when you find out who I really am?" Brenner let out a short laugh. Harper clenched his jaw. "You're just another mouthy girl in heels who thinks she's untouchable. But guess what? Nobody's untouchable without a badge." Raina glanced down, then looked up, answered flatly, "Good, because mine's not visible." End of. Harper squinted, but didn't ask anything else. He shoved her into the car, slammed the door, then turned to Brenner and muttered, "Let's get her processed, before she gets smart again." The door shut, sealing off the outside world, and the tension packed inside the vehicle. But what got silenced wasn't a scream, it was a warning they weren't qualified to recognize yet. On the cement, one tulip petal remained untouched, tilted in the breeze, beside the scraped trail of blood from Raina's knee, a small, silent piece of evidence that would outlast the false report they were about to write. And the girl filming still had her phone steady, no shaking. No talking, just recording the moment when two officers thought they had subdued a woman. But in truth, they had just signed the summons for someone they should have feared long before they reached for their cuffs. The smaller the space, the louder the volume, and humiliation becomes sharper than ever. The patrol car lunged across the pavement like it, too, carried the smugness of the men in the front seats. Raina was shoved into the back bench, wrists still cuffed, back pressed against the sun-heated plastic. The frame was tight, windows sealed, the air dense as if unsaid words were trapped between flesh and metal. She sat at an angle not from weakness, but to keep the cuffs from grinding against already sore bone. Her head leaned against the glass, eyes fixed past the pristine white neighborhood sliding backward, like a misdated dream being ejected from reality. Brenner glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers before darting away like he'd touched a live wire. He smirked the kind of grin people wear when they believe the next question will shatter someone's dignity. "What's his name?" he asked, stretching the words like a bad joke. "Your imaginary husband." The sentence hung in the air like smoke from an unfinished cigarette, clinging to the upholstery. Raina didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. Her voice slid out like a razor across the throat, no blood, just a scar. "Malik, don't worry. He'll remember yours." Each word landed like a steel hook, catching soft points in Brenner's armor. Up front, Harper snorted, shot a look at his partner, then chuckled. "Oh, he watches your TikTok tantrums?" He sneered, his tone sliding along the ceiling like contempt that no longer needed reason to be triggered. Raina closed her eyes for a second, then opened them, catching her own warped reflection in the window's inner curve, distorted by the angle, but still sharp. "He leads men who eliminate threats, the kind you two pretend to be." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Brenner swallow the words sitting on his tongue. The silence that followed wasn't from restraint, it was because no one wanted to be the next to speak. Brenner turned to the right window, tapping his thigh with a finger, like checking if he still existed. Harper scoffed, tapped the steering wheel twice, then exhaled. "Another angry black woman with delusions. How refreshing." He said it like he was diagnosing a patient, but Raina didn't answer. She didn't have to. What she had said was already etched between the dashboard and ceiling, a mark not easily erased. The ride to the station wasn't long, but each meter felt like a weight added to the spine of everyone in the car. No music, no idle chatter. They kept the silence like a no-fly zone, because any word now might spark a fire they weren't equipped to put out. Raina watched the big road sign as they passed it, the logo of Fort Merrick sliding by. Harper tapped the brakes at an intersection, green light washing through the windshield, and briefly revealing the card tucked in his chest pocket. She didn't glance down, but she knew the card had started transmitting. Not sound, not light. A signal one that the system hadn't trained them to detect. Brenner checked the mirror again, slower this time. Raina still stared forward, eyes not angry, not provocative, just checking if the man in the mirror had figured it out yet. But he hadn't, and she knew the ones who don't get it are always the ones who trigger the hardest shockwaves when everything breaks. As the car turned into the station gate, the barrier slid open with Harper's key card, the authorized personal-only sign flashing past like a quiet reminder that some limits only feel controlled. The vehicle stopped, engine cut, and Harper stepped out first. Brenner stood, opened the rear door, and grabbed Raina's arm. His hand touched her wrist with enough pressure to echo the earlier aggression, but this time, his thumb trembled slightly. Raina felt it, and for the first time since being cuffed, she laughed, very softly, very briefly, precisely. "What's so funny?" Brenner growled, brow tightening. She tilted her head, speaking each word like punching in a code. "You two still think you're in control. That's adorable." The words hit Brenner's face like water flung onto hot coals. He yanked her from the car faster than needed, but Harper caught his eye and gave a look. "Don't." That command wasn't for Raina, it was for him. They led her inside, passing 2 young officers on duty. One looked up, about to greet them, but his eyes landed on Raina, dust-covered, sweating, dried blood, not a trace of apology. He fell silent, head down, pen trembling as it left a blot of smeared ink on the page. Behind the opening iron door, Raina entered like a prisoner being walked in, but her steps didn't drag. Each one landed straight, firm, even like someone entering a place they intended to leave their mark. And she knew, from the moment she sat in that patrol car, everything had begun recording, not by police cameras but by eyes belonging to another system. A system that didn't care for threats, and even less for men who touched the wrong person and tried to hide behind borrowed authority. And the most dangerous thing Harper and Brenner hadn't figured out yet, the silence after, "He'll remember yours," had never been a warning. It was a signal, and it had already been sent. No badge grants immunity when bias is the default operating system. Raina was dragged through a pale white hallway, flanked by sealed iron doors like memories locked deep inside a mind that refuses to remember. Harper gripped her right arm, Brenner close behind as if afraid she might run even with her wrists still cuffed. No one read her rights. No one questioned her. They simply pulled, pushed, and locked away. They opened a door separate from the main holding area, an empty room with concrete floor and walls, no chairs, no table, no cameras, no nameplate on the door, no recording system running, just a flickering fluorescent light and the slam of metal echoing down to the knees. Raina was forced to sit on the cold tile. Harper unlocked the cuffs, but within 2 seconds, moved behind her, pressing a hand on her shoulder, forcing her to bend forward. Brenner stood on her right, leaning against the wall, arms crossed like a man observing a trapped animal. A moment later, female duty officer entered. She wore nitrile gloves, eyes blank, like someone long accustomed to female subject checks. Without protocol, Raina didn't resist as they searched her bag. She said nothing when the officer opened her wallet, flipping past receipts, lipstick, then froze at the sight of a hardened card encased in abrasion-proof plastic. It was a military-dependent ID, an unissued model, marked with a number only understood within classified systems. In the lower right corner, Raina MALIK Cole, spouse of active Delta operative. The female officer frowned, not because she understood the full weight of the card, but because she knew the word Delta wasn't used for jokes. She turned to Harper. "She's carrying a military-linked ID." Harper stepped forward, took the card, and studied it like it was a fake library pass from a downtown print shop. He read it aloud, slowly, poking at every layer of meaning. "Spouse of active Delta operative." One slow breath, then he laughed, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling, falling back heavy and hollow. "Cosplay military wife, huh?" He squinted at Raina like he'd uncovered the afternoon's punchline. No one laughed with him. Even Brenner just rolled his eyes. Harper slid the card into his chest pocket, the kind of spot most people use for pens. Raina stared at him, unblinking. No yelling, no forced authority. Just a single sentence, low and clear, like sealing a verdict. "You just pocketed classified identification. You'll regret breathing today." Brenner pushed off the wall, ready to lunge, but Raina's gaze cut through him like a saw blade, halting him mid-step. Harper clicked his tongue, looked away, muttering, "You people love to act like the system owes you something." Raina leaned her head back, spine against the wall, eyes on the ceiling, lips pressed like they were holding in a fury that didn't need release. She didn't need to shout that they were wrong. They knew, and that knowing made the air in the room grow heavier by the second. Down the hall, a printer clicked in short bursts. A young officer at the intake desk glanced at his screen and saw the alert, "ID, not found in public record." He tried again. This time, the system flashed a red message, "Access denied, clearance level exceeded." He frowned, opened the secondary interface, and sent a trace query to the backup system. Immediately, a reply came not from the city network, but from an external server. No location listed, just an encrypted ID ending in JSOC, red, hold. Inside the coordination room, Raina closed her eyes. She didn't track time. She counted the beats of reaction. 1, Harper touched the card. 2, he mocked it. 3, he pocketed it. 4, she said the line. 5, the military system flagged improper possession of a high-clearance ID. 6. The internal protocol began to turn its gears. Brenner stood near the door, fingers fiddling with the cuffs like someone who just realized he could be cuffed by the same tool he held. Harper was still projecting confidence, but his breathing had lost its rhythm. The room felt smaller by the second, not because the walls closed in, but because awareness was expanding. They were no longer the only ones with authority here. A footstep echoed from the hallway, not fast, not heavy, but steady. Raina opened her eyes. She knew that rhythm, not a guard, not a civilian. It was the stride of someone trained to make no sound and still command every corner's attention. Harper turned his head. Brenner took half a step back. The door wasn't even open yet, but no one wanted to stay longer than necessary. And when it opened, the first person in wore no badge. A young woman, hair tied back, black shirt, gloves on, no name given. She didn't ask for a reason for the detainment. She looked directly at Harper, then held out her hand. ID. Harper froze. "Excuse me?" he asked. "The card you just took. It's government property. You're not cleared for retention." Her voice was even. Her eyes carried no question. Harper hesitated 2 seconds, then pulled the card from his pocket, ready with an excuse, but the woman cut in. "This is being logged." She took the card, turned it slightly so the camera clipped to her chest could capture its full surface, then nodded toward Raina. "She's under jurisdictional protection." Harper started to object, but the door opened again. This time, it was the station's commanding officer, Lieutenant Henley. He looked at Raina, looked at Harper, and asked nothing. He just waved a hand. "Release her, immediately." Brenner froze, wanting to ask, based on what? But the moment he saw the woman pull out her phone with the Department of Military Affairs interface on screen, he swallowed it. Harper slapped his thigh, eyes darting away, but his body couldn't hide the bitterness climbing like acid up his throat. Raina stood. Her legs were numb from sitting, but her steps were steady. She didn't look back. She didn't say a word, because everything that needed saying was already replaying in their heads, and that sound wouldn't fade easily. As the door closed behind her, the local access terminal froze. All login records were rerouted to classified override. What had just happened in that small room no longer belonged to the city police system. It belonged to another level, one that needed no court, no prosecutor, but was always spoken of with a tone that never dared say its name. And Malik Cole hadn't even shown up yet, but the consequences had already gone live. Cameras don't save anyone, but sometimes they're the reason an entire city bows its head. Outside the police station gates, the sun cast its shadow across the sidewalk at a rare slanted angle, illuminating every gray brick where Raina had been forced to kneel. The echo of the arrest still hung in the air, the tire screeches, the barked commands, the image of cuffed wrists, bloodied knees, and a twisted dress, all preserved not by witnesses, but by the trembling camera of a teenage girl 4 houses away. She was barely 16, hands shaking as she held up her phone, but her eyes never blinked. Her voice cracked through the clip, hoarse with fear, trying to pass as courage. "She said she lives here. Are you deaf?" The video ran over 4 minutes, starting with Raina being shoved to the ground, a gun pointed at her, then cuffed, all happening in front of her home, beneath deep gold sunlight and heavy breathing. The officers didn't hide their faces, didn't ease their grip, didn't shield the lens. No one cared who might be watching, because in that moment, they believed they held absolute power. But that clip, uploaded 5 minutes later to a social platform, became the beginning of something they couldn't control. The caption was only 6 words. She warned them. Now we wait. No hashtags, no effects, just a clear image of Raina staring directly at Harper and Brenner, saying in an icy tone, "My husband will ruin you." That part was slowed down 3 times by the uploader, and the comments beneath it exploded literally. A former soldier watching from his home in another state paused at the 40-second mark. He zoomed in, studied Raina's eyes as her head was pinned down, but her face stayed up, her gaze steady, no screams, no thrashing. He didn't look at the cops, he didn't look at the blood, he looked at her posture, and he muttered, "That's military silence. She's not bluffing." He posted that same comment under the video, followed by, "Former JSOC, I know the look, something's coming." Oh, within the hour, the clip passed 3 million views. The official page of the American Veterans Association reshared it with the caption, "Who is Malik Cole?" From there, 2 parallel threads erupted across forums. One about Raina, the woman arrested for living the wrong color in a too white neighborhood, and the other about the name Malik Cole, A title no one spelled right the first time, but one that surfaced simultaneously across dozens of threads by anonymous users who specialized in high-level military ops. A Twitter user named @Echo6 posted, "You don't say Delta on camera unless you're connected, and if she's not bluffing, they didn't arrest a civilian. They intercepted a message." That line was reshared over 70,000 times. No one asked, intercepted what? Because in the clip, what mattered wasn't the violence, it was the warning they ignored. An Asian American civil rights attorney in New York shared, "We're about to see what happens when systemic bias meets military-grade retribution." Meanwhile, media experts panicked over the speed of the spread. The video had already been clipped into dozens of versions, some with subtitles, some with adjusted lighting, to better show Brenner's reaction to the name Malik. One in particular paired RAINA'S line, "He'll remember yours," with a real-life photo of a man in a decorated military uniform, his face blurred. The uploader gave no name, just a caption, "Malik doesn't need a badge, he's the reason badges exist." In another state, at a cafe, two college students sat across from each other. One held up a phone, pointed at the video, and asked, "You see her eyes?" The other nodded, whispered, "That's the look of someone who knows the law and knows exactly when it'll break." On the floor, a little boy tugged at his mother's arm, repeating, "Mom, she said her husband will ruin them. What does it mean?" The mother pulled him along, silent, because she didn't want to explain that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms, but from a system quiet, exact, and long past, needing to prove it's right. Inside the newsroom of a major network, an editor was reviewing scripts when someone rushed in with a phone. "Boss, the wife in the police arrest clip? Her husband might be a Delta Force commander. It's unconfirmed, but it's everywhere." The producer looked up. "Confirmed or not, we run it. Front page. We lead with her eyes." And as the sun began to fall, the golden light no longer angled across the sidewalk. A small group had gathered outside the police station. They carried no signs. They chanted no slogans. They simply stood silent, phones raised, eyes fixed on the gray building housing a history of mistakes that always thought they'd stay buried. A middle-aged man in a faded t-shirt, holding a baseball cap, stood at the front of the line and said to the person beside him, "We're not here for a protest. We're here to witness what silence looks like before it turns into consequence." Everyone was waiting for an answer, but not from the police. From a man who hadn't appeared yet. Malik Cole hadn't spoken. He hadn't shown his face. But everyone knew, if that warning was real, every move that followed would be the chain reaction of the system. He represents a place where no one says a word too many, no one draws late, and no one, ever, stays still when someone they love is dragged in the street. And when Malik speaks, it won't be through press interviews. It'll be through action. Action that forces systems to change protocol before they can name what just happened. And everyone from the teenage girl filming, to the veteran quietly holding a cup of coffee, to the mother pulling her child down the street is waiting for one thing. They don't want anyone else to get hurt, but they want to know, if a woman can be arrested right in front of her own home for staying silent, how long will it take before that silence explodes from the other side? And this time, they won't turn off their phones. They won't close the curtains. They'll watch, because they need to know, if it happened in a white neighborhood on a golden afternoon, it can happen anywhere. What state are you in? Because if you think this is happening somewhere else, maybe you haven't looked closely at the eyes staring straight into power in that video, and maybe the place you live in is the next one that has to bow its head. Data moved faster than expected. Less than 4 hours after the video was posted, an anonymous account with a strange signature began resharing the original clip with a short caption, "Signal verified, spread, no profile picture, and no comments." But its followers, hundreds of them, were veterans, retired officers, people once tied to high-level strategic branches where silence orders held more weight than kill commands. Within that circle, the account was known simply as Zulu Ghost. Whenever it shared something, it was never meaningless. The clip now bore a distinct watermark, with second-by-second analysis, highlighting in slow motion the moment Raina was pinned to the sidewalk, not to chase views but to pinpoint a frame, when she was forced down, knee hitting concrete, body collapsing, but her gaze never shifting. She didn't flinch from the camera, didn't squint from fear. A deep male voice, source unidentified, overlaid the breakdown. That's not fear, that's preparation. The zoom stopped at one frozen frame, Raina's eyes as her wrists were twisted and her head pushed forward. Her expression wasn't helpless, it was pulled tight, like a cord wound to the breaking point. In the lower left corner, her wallet lay on the ground next to the shattered tulips, and in one rare frame, sunlight hit the transparent plastic just right, revealing a faint code printed on the card inside. Not the full sequence, but enough. Delta, DV, 1, US, Priv, Access. A former military data analyst working remotely in the Colorado Highlands sat upright at the sight of that frame. She zoomed in, captured it, and cross-referenced it with sealed documentation from 2 years ago. It took less than 3 minutes. That code wasn't issued to civilians. It couldn't be forged. More importantly, it wasn't allowed to appear publicly unless someone had broken a rule they didn't even understand enough to violate. At the same moment, inside Fort Liberty, the high-level signal monitoring room remained quiet until a new alert flashed. No alarm. No lights, just a red line of text. Tier 4, contact triggered. Source, Civ footage. ID embedded signature. Matched. The cybersecurity officer on duty called the watch commander immediately. Within 10 seconds, the clip and all metadata were routed through a secure channel, bypassing the internal network entirely. The footage wasn't AI processed, wasn't image tagged, and required no verification. The internal tag read, emotionless, coordinated, trained, react accordingly. The information was relayed to the Eastern Command without passing through any legal department. A colonel, reviewing briefings in the hallway, took an emergency call. He walked straight into the strategy room, gloves still on, and said 4 words, "Pull the active roster." A young officer stood up, opened the red clearance access screen, and the system prompted for biometric confirmation. The colonel tapped the desk without looking at the monitor. "She's not alone," he said, like repeating a line of doctrine this team had never been taught. "She's never been." The system displayed the tactical response chart for each scenario. Tier 4 was not in the range of delay. Tier 4 meant the subject was tied to personnel with strategic military clearance, and any engagement involving them, even if civilian, was logged as a high-threat breach. Fort Liberty dispatched an alert 3 destinations: Eastern Command, the Southeast Security Hub, and the internal comms team at the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, a group of veterans in another state received a message from Zulu Ghost through an encrypted private channel. It was a single line, no intro. Malik Cole's house was breached. Civilian entry. Wife taken. One of the recipients was a liaison from the Interagency Joint Training Program who had served with Malik in Syria. He read the message, said nothing, and replied with a single dagger emoji, the team's old silent code for order received, no questions. At a cafe, a middle-aged man opened an old laptop and logged into a hidden forum, one built for the former right hands of counter-terror missions the government never acknowledged. He stared at the screen, then typed in a command, reversed entry logic, conditional override, trigger, R-Cole. Then he stood, paid his bill, and walked out as if he had never been there. Elsewhere, in a small town hundreds of miles away, a defense technician scrolling social media saw the clip and caught a detail most people missed: the officer's reactions after hearing the name Malik Cole. He didn't look at Raina. He didn't study the arrest. He focused on Brenner's reflex, how his eyes cut toward the camera, his body recoiled, then stiffened exactly like someone who'd just heard a name that wasn't supposed to be said. He rewound it 3 times. Then, he opened a cross-reference file where the name Malik had once appeared unofficially under coded access logs. Clearance, black, access, NEEDTOKN-OW only. The ripple didn't travel in a straight line. It spread outward, in concentric layers, each one reaching a branch of the system designed to stay dormant unless someone touched the wrong person. And now, it had awakened, not to respond with gunfire, but in a language Harper and Brenner were never taught at the academy. A language that requires no announcements, just a signal, and that signal had been sent, not from Raina's mouth, but from her eyes, from the card in her wallet, and from the moment she raised her head in front of armed men without ever bowing. No one could have rescued her then, but that wasn't the point. She didn't need saving. She just needed the system to receive the signal at the right moment. And now, it was answering, layer by layer, step by step, in silence, far from harmless. The meeting room floor was lined with thin carpet, but not enough to muffle the sound of urgent footsteps. Station Commander, Lieutenant Dale Ramick, had just stepped out of the watch office when his phone buzzed 3 times, followed by the sound of the door opening from the duty officer. A high-priority internal email had just arrived. Subject line brief. Red flag match. Civilian subject cross. Linked to Sentinel tier. Ramick read the content in under 5 seconds, but his expression shifted, as if someone had poured ice water down his spine. The first line was clear. Involved civilian matches profile flagged in Operation Sentinel. Clearance Tier 4. Below that, the original encoded transmission from Fort Liberty, including a military document photo, a wedding portrait of a Delta Force soldier standing beside a black woman whose gaze seemed to challenge the camera itself. She smiled faintly, hand in hand with her husband. But her eyes weren't aimed at the lens, they looked off-frame to the right, like she already sensed something didn't belong at the wedding. Ramick grabbed the printed photo and moved quickly into the meeting room, where Harper and Brenner sat at the far end of the table, looking tired. An administrative officer had just powered up the projector, but hadn't clicked anything before Ramick pulled the cord out. Heads turned. Ramick placed the photo in the center of the table, wasting no time. "Explain this." Harper glanced down and shrugged. "It's a wedding photo. Cute dress." No one laughed. No one moved. Ramick pulled out a chair, sat, and spoke evenly. "The woman you arrested is flagged in a federal protection system. She's not a random civilian. She's a protected designation with cross-agency coordination." Brenner furrowed his brow, lips parting to ask something, but Harper cut in, leaning back. "Look, she's a civilian. She didn't have any weapons. No ID on her at the time. We handled it clean." Ramick tapped his index finger on the table 3 times, then laid down 2 more photos. 1. A document confirming special dependent status for an active-duty service member deployed overseas, signed by the Army Command. The other, a scan of a disrupted phone call placed by Raina just before the arrest, its destination listed as a coded coordination hub inside Red Zulu Tactical Zone. "You didn't handle a shoplifter. You intercepted a strategic asset with a back channel to military intelligence." The room fell silent, like a trigger pulled frozen mid-squeeze. Harper scoffed, but the sound didn't quite form into a full laugh. "So what now?" he asked, his voice missing its usual edge. Ramick didn't answer right away. He turned to the secretary, nodded. She set down 2 documents, each in a red-marked envelope, without saying a word. Ramick opened them, pulled out 2 temporary suspension orders, and signed them on the spot. The ink was still warm. The top line in bold, "Pending federal review. Tier 4 interference. You're both suspended. Effective immediately. Turn in your sidearms and badges before leaving the building." He didn't look at them again, his eyes already on the side monitor, where more data was streaming in. Brenner froze, face drained white. Harper clenched his jaw, shifted like he was about to speak, then exhaled hard through his nose. "You're serious?" he asked. "Because of a woman who threw a few threats around?" Ramick didn't blink. "Because of a woman," he said slowly, "whose presence triggered 3 federal pings and a multi-agency protocol. You think this is about her being mouthy?" His voice was low, never raised, but each word struck like a sledgehammer pounding into the empty shell of Harper's sense of consequence. The room stayed still. A young officer near the door took a deep breath and stepped back, as if making way for what was about to unfold. Ramick pressed a button on the table, calling internal security. "Escort them." Quietly, the moment the words left his mouth, the main door swung open without a knock. The door made no sharp sound, but no one missed the presence now entering. 3 individuals stepped in no visible weapons, no uniforms, but their posture and movement made it obvious to anyone with time near an operation. These were not city personnel. The one in front was a tall man, wearing a reverse-facing watch on his left wrist and a small scar running from the tendon to the forearm. His eyes swept over Harper and Brenner without needing names. The one in the center held a tablet, interface open with no logo. The third, at the rear, carried a small sealed pouch, the same military ID of RAINA'S that Harper had held. None of them spoke. None asked for explanations. Ramick stood, stepping aside, as if he had expected this from the moment the email arrived. The man with the tablet approached, held the screen up for Ramick to see. The display read, "Secondary extraction in motion. Do not engage civilian media." Below that, a single command. Authority. Sentinel lock. Non-negotiable. No one in the room could say a word. Harper started to step forward, but the lead man merely shifted half a pace, his gaze landing on Harper's throat for less than a second. Harper stopped, shoulders slumping, swallowing the quiet humiliation he had never been trained to face. Brenner stepped back completely, silent, frozen, watching everything unravel in front of him. "Where is she now?" the man with the tablet asked, speaking for the first time. His tone wasn't low or high, it was steady, like a ticking clock counting down to the point of no return. Ramek pointed toward the hallway. "Released. She's outside." The man nodded, turned, and the three exited the room just as they had entered, quietly, yet unmistakably, each movement stamping itself into the memory of everyone left behind. The door closed, and the room suddenly felt larger, not because they had left, but because everything that just happened had knocked the air out of the two suspended officers' chests. Ramek sat back down, hands resting on the table, his eyes distant as if staring through the wood into a future they had just blocked themselves from reaching. He turned to the administrative officer and spoke softly, "Start scanning all system access from the past 24 hours. If anyone touched Raina Cole's file without clearance, I want to know immediately." She nodded without asking why. And from that moment on, the entire police station began to understand. They had touched someone who didn't need to shout to walk free, didn't need a weapon to regain control, and didn't need a courtroom to make an entire system bow. They had touched Raina Cole, and if they didn't yet know who Malik was, everything that just happened in that room was the introduction. Real power doesn't need to shout, it only needs to look, and everyone understands. The afternoon slid gently across the row of tightly parked vehicles outside the police station, the sunlight no longer sharp but shifting to a soft amber hue that wrapped the space like a muted filter. Amid the chaotic movement of civilians gathering outside, a dark gray SUV with a matte finish, no logo, and no license plate silently rolled into the lot. It stopped in a no parking zone beneath a "reserved for chief" sign, but no one approached to ask it to move. The door opened without a sound, and a man in civilian clothes stepped out. He was tall, muscular, square-shouldered, black jeans lightly dusted from the road, a gray shirt tucked cleanly, a faded scar across his left wrist, and eyes locked on the building as if everything ahead was a target waiting to be acquired. That was Malik Cole. He said nothing as he shut the car door. No expression showed urgency or demand, yet each step Malik took onto the pavement made those nearby instinctively step back. The crowd outside had started live streaming, but the lenses of phones began to tremble, not because Malik moved fast, but because no one wanted to remain in the path of someone carrying an unsigned order. He passed through the crowd as if no one existed, never stopping to glance, and no one had a reason to stop him. His eyes weren't searching or scanning. They already knew the direction. The target had been locked in 3 states ago. The automatic doors of the main lobby opened. Malik entered. The light inside was cooler than outside, but not enough to dim the heat radiating from him. A young, thin officer posted at the reception name tag. Dawson saw the man approach and reacted by the book. Hand lifted, half bow, mouth starting to ask, "Sir, can I help?" But the question never finished. Malik's gaze cut through his forehead like a silent command. Not angry, not scowling, not aggressive, but enough to freeze Dawson in place. His hand didn't drop, but didn't move forward either. Every internal signal in him registered what it meant. This man wasn't here to ask for permission. Malik continued through the lobby, passing 3 admin staff near the records desk. A middle-aged man looked up, about to speak, then reached for his phone. But when Malik's gaze flicked his way, his thumb froze just above the screen. He quietly slid the phone back into his pocket and stared at his shoes. Malik's footsteps echoed evenly across the tiled floor, not rushed, not slow, not theatrical, but each one marked a step closer to the fault line where the system had just made its biggest mistake since it believed it could define who counts as civilian and who does not. The coordination room door opened from the inside. A tech supervisor stepped out and nearly collided with Malik. He stopped just in time, blinked, then instinctively backed away. Malik didn't pause, didn't read his name. He walked on to the center of the main corridor, where cross-angled ceiling cameras live-streamed directly to the station's official channel. There, 2 cameras were active, each capturing a full shot of the lobby. Both caught the moment Malik stopped, turned his head to the right toward the desk of an officer who had just returned from break. Malik didn't need to ask who was in charge. He already had every detail before he even left the car. He stood tall, hands relaxed at his sides, body aligned perfectly with the center of the room, and then he spoke just one sentence, voice low, calm, just loud enough to register on the mics of both recording cameras. "Release my wife, or you'll answer to a court no one survives." The sentence landed like a blade cutting clean through the room. No one shouted, no one moved. But in the next 10 seconds, the police department's live stream disconnected 3 times, comment sections jammed with overload, and someone typed that sentence into the chat over 100 times. Others rewound the video, frame by frame, analyzing every shift in expression, but they weren't looking for a rag or threat. They were watching how Malik stood straight, solid, not a single wasted motion, as if he didn't need anyone to believe he could make it happen, because he knew, if necessary, it wouldn't be a courtroom that spoke, but those without name tags who force entire systems to change their color codes. And now, only one question hovered, quiet as ash falling onto a red switch. Who dares not to answer? Outside, wind moved gently through the lot, brushing a thin layer of dust across the police department sign. The air didn't whistle, but it was tight enough to hear every blink. Some of the people outside still didn't understand exactly what was happening, but collective instinct had already started to spread like an electric charge. Someone important had arrived. And those who had seen the video before, watching Malik's silhouette standing motionless inside the building, all thought the same thing. He's here, and he's not bluffing. The police station lobby shrank into a strange stillness after Malik crossed the threshold. No one had been summoned, yet everyone was present, scattered in corners, unfinished files in hand, all eyes locked on the man who had just pulled the full weight of a system back onto its proper axis. Malik didn't care who was watching. He walked straight toward the holding cells as if every tile beneath him had been marked ahead of time. When he reached the 4th cell, the iron door was still closed, but his mind had already passed through it from the first second. Inside, Raina sat upright, back not touching the wall, eyes wide open and unusually calm, as if she were the final variable in an equation the entire station had never dared solve. He opened the door. No one stopped him. His hand rested on her shoulder, light and firm. No need for questions, no embrace. Their eyes locked like two elements completing a circuit. His voice came out crisp and final. "They're done." Not reassurance. Confirmation that those who thought they were the law had crossed into territory above their clearance. Raina stood without needing to steady herself. She walked with him not as someone being protected, but as someone who had just completed the first phase of a test the system had already failed without realizing it. Malik didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't glance at the open files on the desk. He didn't need further evidence. Her very presence here was already proof of a misfire, and the consequences had begun etching their names onto the list of things not to be forgotten. As they passed down the corridor back to the lobby, every door slowly closed behind them like a domino effect, not from wind, but from those inside no longer willing to witness. One officer at the end of the hall started to speak, but only inhaled and swallowed the words. He didn't look Malik in the eye. He didn't meet Raina's gaze. He stared at his own belt, as if questioning whether that badge meant anything beyond being a piece of zinc-plated metal in a system now dwarfed by something far larger than local authority. As Raina and Malik turned into the main lobby, 2 outdoor live stream cameras caught the moment no one programmed them to, but everyone paused, scrolling to watch. Not because they understood what had happened, but because something in the way they moved, in the space between them, in the tilt of Raina's chin and the way Malik didn't bother scanning the room, created a very specific kind of silence. The silence of people realizing they had just brushed against a systemic force whose aftershock would stretch far beyond this building. A child in the live stream crowd blurted out when he saw the image. They didn't walk out of the station, they walked out of their control. That line spread faster across social media than any caption ever could. And when Malik reached for the main door and stepped into the daylight spilling across the stone steps, no one said goodbye. Because here, the only person who had the authority to end it had already done so. In 6 words, and in a look that never needed repeating. Brenner's breathing was ragged, each footstep pounding the tile floor like he was trying to chase down something that had already escaped his understanding. He entered just as Malik turned away from the holding area, posture unmoved, gaze free of retreat. The words that burst from Brenner's mouth didn't come from reason, but from the primal reflex of someone long used to owning a room. "You can't just walk in here." But what happened next wasn't in any internal protocol playbook. Malik turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Brenner's face like a flashlight in an interrogation room with no chairs. He didn't flash a badge, didn't hold up credentials, didn't lean on any symbol of rank. He just spoke, voice steady, no growl, yet every word forged like steel. "I already did," "Sit down," 6 words, not loud, not long, but the echo flipped everything once considered procedural. The whole lobby held its breath, like someone had yanked the plug on a machine that had been malfunctioning for years. Brenner froze, as if something inside him had just been factory reset. No one stepped forward to steady him. No one coached him on what to do next. A young officer at a side desk glanced over, then quickly looked away, like he'd just witnessed a structural collapse and didn't want to be named in the report. The typing stopped. The radios quieted. Paperwork paused. Malik stood still for one more second, then turned and continued walking, as if the interruption had never happened. The entire moment lasted less than 10 seconds, but its aftershocks would ripple for weeks through closed-door meetings, leaked emails, and security footage clips accidentally shared. Outside, across the street, a live-stream camera mounted on a tripod caught the whole thing. From Brenner's outburst to Malik's turn to those 6 compressed words, soft as a punch to the chest of local authority. The video was reposted within 4 minutes under the title, "The Moment Silence Turned into a Sentence." No edits, no soundtrack. Viewers paused exactly at the 8th second, rewinding 3 times to track the shift in Brenner's eyes from disbelief to helplessness, to a lowered head that no one could tell was from submission or realization. The comments split into 2 camps. Half were from people who'd been forced into silence by opaque institutions, and the other half were from people who'd thought they were on the right side until they felt their own instinct take a step back in the presence of someone who didn't need to yell to reclaim space. One independent journalist wrote, "This wasn't about power. It was about proportion. When real authority speaks, the room stops pretending." That quote was reposted thousands of times alongside the clip of Malik standing still like a transmission tower in a system being reset. The silence that followed wasn't the end. It was a signal broadcast to every place still deluded enough to think they controlled who enters and who walks out. 6 words, a single camera angle, and one unmoved stance enough to leave arrogance with nowhere to anchor itself. And from that day on, in internal law enforcement trainings across multiple states, the video was embedded into the module titled Unexpected Scenarios. Lesson 9. When you're no longer the loudest voice in the room. 1 hour after the gray SUV vanished from the precinct's front-facing camera, social media data flowed like a surge, spilling straight off a mountain. On Platform X, the hashtag number MALIK hit the #1 national trend in under 40 minutes, surpassing political developments and peak-hour sports coverage. The clip of RAINA'S arrest and her brief shoulder touch with Malik in the holding cell was split into countless edits, some set to cinematic scores, others slowed down and subtitled with military confidential font. High-follower TikTok accounts rushed to use the 6-word line, "I already did, sit down," as audio for reaction clips. On Instagram, RAINA'S cold expression while being forced to kneel on the sidewalk became a viral sticker among Black creators, captioned, "Respect has a posture." On YouTube, wave after wave of tone and body language breakdowns were uploaded by the hour, dissecting Malik's every movement, frame by frame, as if decoding footage from a classified training tape. But what made people pause longer than any flashy cut was a short post, no photo attached, from a verified account belonging to a retired Delta Force soldier. The post was just 18 words. "I know Malik. If he's moving publicly, someone's about to get dismantled. He doesn't show up without precision." The tweet landed like a closing blow to a crowd chasing clips for emotion. Suddenly, it clicked: if someone like Malik shows up in public quiet, unarmed, unescorted, it means a system is about to be dismantled piece by piece from within. Journalists began digging through old military archives, trying to connect the dots between partially declassified Black Ops and the name Cole, possibly tucked into margins of obscure reports. A 2012 article about a hostage rescue in East Africa resurfaced, describing, "The team leader remained unnamed. Witnesses recall only a man with a calm voice and an unflinching presence." The comments filled with urgency. Was it him? If this is real, who the hell would touch a man like that's wife? The city police department's official account was forced to disable comments within 2 hours. Every unrelated post was flooded with upside-down triangle emojis, the unofficial symbol of Delta Force in modern internet culture. Civil rights groups began circulating the hashtag number RAINA Raina was right, as a declaration of belief long denied. A university professor posted a long status analyzing Raina's silence in the holding cell as a hyperlinguistic form of resistance, where calm came not from surrender, but from standing above prejudice. Beneath that post, another veteran left a comment: "She didn't need to shout, she had clearance." That line was turned into a quote graphic and shared across platforms as a way to reframe a kind of power that's always been dismissed as quiet. But this time, it was that very quiet that made an entire country pause to reconsider who really gets to speak. 1 hour after the number MALIK wave swept through social media, flow of information began to shift. It was no longer just clips capturing the silent assertion of power, fragments of the past unearthed like a geological layer never meant to be touched. A veteran investigative journalist from the Washington inquest, while combing through old military databases, discovered that Raina's name wasn't simply tied to civilian records or the marriage of a special ops officer. She had once served as a strategic advisor to a little-known federal program, one designed to protect individuals with deep ties to personnel in strategic response units. She wasn't just the woman behind the soldier. She helped rewrite the risk classification protocol used to protect people like her husband. Once that file surfaced, more traces followed: closed-door congressional hearings where Raina had testified, internal memos where her name appeared alongside intelligence reps, and all of it pointed to one fact: the woman forced to kneel on the sidewalk wasn't just married to someone with clearance. She was a high-security access point herself, the kind of file law enforcement is trained to avoid, not because she's dangerous, but because the fallout from touching her exceeds their operational scope. The internet paused for a beat before erupting again, this time over a quote from an old interview with Raina, dug up from a 6-year-old segment on a local television program. In it, the host asked, "Aren't you afraid, working in systems traditionally run by men?" She sat straight, eyes steady, and answered softly but firmly, "I don't kneel. I don't bluff. I just wait for consequences." The quote, forgotten for years, became an instant icon. It was printed on shirts, turned into digital artwork, and posted across feminist news pages and military forums alike. Those who once criticized her for not yelling in the video now voiced admiration. The debate over whether she was right to warn, "My husband will ruin you," evaporated because now everyone understood it wasn't a threat. It was a cold, precise reminder of consequences that had already been programmed. As major media outlets officially placed Raina's name in evening headlines, talk shows pivoted to discussions about the role of black women in American power structures. A Stanford scholar wrote, "People confuse silence with weakness, but some women don't need to shout, don't need to fight back. One look is enough, and an entire framework will flip." A comment below added, "That's not silence, that's patience, weaponized." And for the first time, people who once believed in the authority of badges began to question whether the system they proudly served ever truly understood the role of those it had sidelined for lacking a uniform. The questions remained unanswered, but one thing was clear: Raina wasn't waiting for pity, she was waiting for the trigger. And it arrived right when she sat up straight in that cold holding cell, before anyone realized the fallout was already cascading through encrypted signal paths. On the 8th floor of a federal building near the administrative center, the door to Conference Room 3 closed with a dry metallic click, just as the Special Investigations Unit of the Office of the Inspector General formally took over the case, involving the Jefferson County Police Department. The meeting had no press, no cameras, no courtesy. By 7 a.m., an emergency seal order had been signed. Legal staff, alongside cybersecurity specialists, entered the precinct immediately and accessed the entire data infrastructure. 3 servers were removed from the criminal monitoring room and loaded into an unmarked vehicle. The data loss was pinpointed to the exact time Raina was escorted into the patrol car. The remaining footage showed multiple irregular frame cuts manually altered, bypassing system protocols. One forensic technician said aloud during the preliminary review, "They tried to erase evidence, but forgot every street camera already caught it. You can wipe a building's data, but you can't wipe the internet." In the interview room, Harper sat across from 2 federal agents, spine rigid, lips dry. He had been prepped by his attorney, but his eyes gave away the fatigue of a man who once believed he was untouchable. When asked for the reason behind the arrest, Harper insisted she had a defiant attitude. No one pounded the table. A female investigator simply leaned forward, rotated her pen slightly, and asked in a flat voice, "Is that a crime?" The question flipped the entire concept of authority. Harper fell silent, then turned his face away, avoiding her gaze. What he thought was a justification became self-incrimination, because the justice system wasn't designed to protect an officer's ego, nor to legitimize bias under the guise of law enforcement. In the next room, another agent was running data recovery software. A timeline analysis confirmed that Brenner's body cam had been manually disconnected. Notably, the rare surviving footage showed Raina standing upright, hands calm, mouth closed, eyes fixed on the camera, a stare later compared to a blade colder than any spoken protest. The analyst watched it 5 times in slow motion before typing into the report, "No signs of resistance, evidence of provocation." That entry would become key in reopening the department's tactical training protocols. Meanwhile, outside, a team of civil rights attorneys in coordination with federal legal counsel began filing for an expanded criminal investigation. They listed 3 violations: unlawful arrest, off-camera interrogation, and destruction of evidence tied to a federally protected identity. Of all the infractions, the one that drew the Inspector General's sharpest focus was Brenner's act of pocketing Raina's military-dependent ID, a move categorized as tampering with military-affiliated identification. One internal affairs officer even handwrote in the case log, "If the card is real, and he pocketed it knowing what it means, that's not just misconduct, that's obstruction under federal law." That line was bolded in the attached report, sent directly to the Department of Justice. At this point, the story was no longer about a wrongful arrest or personal rights. It had become a real-time test of how the system reacts when its authority is challenged by someone who understands the law better than those enforcing it. And if Raina once said she was waiting for consequences, then every keystroke, every line of recovered data, every investigator's gaze locked onto Harper's nonverbal cues was the consequence taking shape not out of anger, but out of the need for clarity. A woman dragged away in broad daylight, showing no threat, carrying nothing but a bouquet, had now triggered a chain of case files being reassembled from scratch because of 6 words: she had a defiant attitude. And in the eyes of the law, that statement costs more than a pair of cuffs. A summons for Malik Cole was issued from the Office of the Inspector General under urgent classification, requesting his presence to provide testimony related to the incident at Jefferson Precinct. But the response from the military left no room for ambiguity. The official reply, stamped by the U.S. Special Operations Command, stated clearly, "Malik Cole is acting under protected responsibility within the Military Honor Code in his capacity to apply protective response when immediate family faces threat or violation of lawful rights." The answer was not evasive nor apologetic. It was a constitutional declaration, concise and capable of cutting through any blurred claims of jurisdiction. Malik's presence at the precinct, his intervention in an unlawful detention, was not considered a breach. Instead, it was classified as a justified response within the legal gray zone of military protocol, where family protection equals absolute duty. That acknowledgement forced federal investigators to concede that they were now facing a parallel sphere of authority where discipline, honor, and action can override courtroom procedures without requiring permission. Beyond the diplomatic reply, the military also proactively attached a 6-page briefing marked with internal codes, citing Clause 16C of the Special Operations Statute. The content stated, "In the event that a direct family member of a Strategic Response Unit officer is detained by local forces under conditions suggestive of civil rights violations, the authorized individual, in this case, spouse, is entitled to initiate the Family Honor Protection Protocol, formalized under the 2016 amendment." The report further noted that Malik Cole had participated in 3 high-level joint federal missions, had direct training under the Department of Defense, and was rated exceptional, with clearance for independent action in active theaters. In its conclusion, the command noted, "Malik Cole's presence and conduct at Jefferson Precinct have been reviewed. All actions fall within permitted boundaries." The tone was cold, but the political weight behind the words forced the entire federal apparatus to take pause, because this wasn't just a defense of an individual, it was a shield raised by the military for someone they considered the backbone of their unit. The online community received the announcement as a declaration of victory. Within 30 minutes of the news breaking on major outlets, hashtags shifted from questions to affirmations. On Platform X, Number MALIK was now paired with the phrase "authorized to act," as if to confirm that everything that had happened from the shoulder tap in the holding cell to the 6 words spoken in the precinct lobby had already been sanctioned. Some called it a response stamped by the Department of Defense. Strategic response law experts began appearing on television, explaining the constitutionality of Clause 16C, showing that Malik's silence wasn't avoidance, it was certainty. He knew he didn't need to say more once the system behind him had spoken. And in the Inspector General's office, a young investigator stared at the email reply and muttered a sentence that never made it into the official transcript but was heard by everyone in the room. They didn't just send a man, they sent a doctrine. That wasn't exaggeration, because after that day, every misconduct protocol in Jefferson had to be reviewed not by the courts, but by the Department of Defense, because sometimes the presence of a single person is enough to reset the scope of authority legally and without appeal. On Monday morning at the State Government Building, Conference Room 2, normally reserved for budget hearings, filled to capacity in under 10 minutes after the governor issued an emergency summons. The session wasn't on the press schedule and didn't include the usual lobbying groups. All enforcement agencies connected to the Jefferson Precinct incident were ordered to attend, especially the director of the state police. The governor opened without a speech or greetings, just one direct sentence amid the rustling of papers. "I need a full report, minute by minute, every decision, every approval level that led to the arrest of a civilian with special military ties in broad daylight." The room's atmosphere sank, as if the ceiling had suddenly dropped a few inches. Government aides and legal clerks immediately opened laptops and typed non-stop. The screen displayed a timeline of events, starting from the patrol car's turn into the residential area, ending with the 6-word clip, "I already did, sit down," included in the video report. Director MALIK stood in a light gray suit, his tie askew like it had been pulled on hastily. He didn't use defensive tones, but couldn't hide the unease in his voice. In a presentation lasting less than 12 minutes, he admitted that both officers, Harper and Brenner, were not trained to handle situations involving civilians with military ties. He also confirmed that the current risk assessment system did not integrate military-linked addresses with the real-time patrol software. A council member immediately challenged, "So officers are allowed to act freely in neighborhoods housing federally protected identities without any special training?" MALIK bowed his head. "The current system has no legal mandate to differentiate those situations." A female legislator slammed her hand on the table. "So you're telling me people like RAINA are just live test subjects for software bugs?" The question wasn't answered directly, but it set off murmurs and the heavy tapping of pens around the room. A black councilman stood and cited Clause 2.7 of the Public Safety Code, which mandates that any civilian connected to strategic military personnel be treated as sensitive, with restricted access for civilian law enforcement. He pointed to the bolded line, "This isn't about officer protection. This is a systemic failure, and RAINA isn't the first." The display switched to a graph. Over the past 3 years, at least 4 military-linked civilians had been mishandled without meaningful legal consequences. And this time, the only difference was, her husband knew how to use power at the right time. The others didn't. At that moment, no one dared reduce the case to personal misconduct. The session turned into an unofficial hearing, forcing representatives from the military, the Department of Internal Affairs, the Legal Office, and the State Judicial Council to sit together and re-examine all protocols for handling incidents involving military-linked individuals. A special task force was proposed on the spot, with a mandate to present a reform draft to the governor within 3 weeks, outlining how to classify special status civilians and the corresponding rules of engagement. RAINA wasn't present, but her name was spoken at least 27 times in 2 hours, and MALIK, though absent, remained the shadow, forcing the entire system to ask itself, what will they do next time if he doesn't walk in alone, but stands for a generation that knows exactly what their rights are, and when those rights demand respect? The question came from the third row, a clear voice, steady and calm. A silver-haired female legislator, serving her 3rd term on the Executive Oversight Committee, placed the transcript on the table, looked directly at Director MALIK, and asked, "Why was a woman standing outside her own home deemed a threat?" The entire room sank. No one answered immediately. No one could. The question wasn't just for MALIK, it was for the entire response mechanism that had produced this outcome. It struck at every department, every title seated in the room known as the legal engine of the state, forcing each person to re-examine the very processes they had long cited as protective doctrine. The silence lasted long enough to give time a shape, long enough for the stenographer to start tapping the table rhythmically, as if to confirm this wasn't a dream, and every word spoken today would be recorded in policy ink, not media ink. MALIK didn't bow his head, but his eyes no longer met the woman who asked the question. He looked back, toward the screen showing the clip of Raina standing at her gate, holding a bouquet, lips still, eyes forward. No aggression, no advance, no resistance, just presence, and for someone in the system, that presence alone was enough to justify a command to draw a weapon. The other legislators didn't follow up, not because they were indifferent, but because at this moment, any further rhetoric felt excessive. That question carried the weight of an indictment already rendered. It rendered phrases like uncooperative attitude, suspicious behavior, or excessive reaction into melting ice under the heat of public scrutiny. A legal advisor seated behind the hearing table lowered his head and typed quietly into his phone, face unreadable. The short note read, "We built a system where fear response holds more authority than human nature." In the air now filled only with the sound of ceiling fans and tapping pens, everyone understood no one remained untouched enough to look away. The legislator's question wasn't meant to bring someone down, but to sink the inertia that allowed a black woman, standing upright with steady eyes, to be classified by the system as a potential threat. And so, the government session shifted from hearing to reckoning. One participant, a behavioral specialist who once consulted on police brutality cases, handwrote in their notes, "When law enforcement views confidence as danger, that's no longer order, that's reflexive oppression." Outside the chamber, reporters waited in silence, the only ones who knew that some questions, once asked, need no answer because the silence that follows is itself the consequence. And in that moment, every second of silence carried the shape of a summons the system could no longer defer. No one turned on their mic, no one reached for their water glass. Only the steady rhythm of pens echoed, like the heartbeat of a society just realizing it had let fear replace law, and bias distort the very shape of reason. In front of dozens of lenses, microphones pointed from every direction, and camera shutters clicking like rain on stone, Raina Cole stepped off the Jefferson Precinct's stone steps and stood upright beneath the ash-gray sky just before the first storm of the season. Her dress was neat, arms relaxed, posture steady. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't cry, didn't hold up any signs. That calm alone brought a few seconds of hush over the press corps, as if everyone had braced for a storm but received instead a silence sharp enough to cut. The first questions came politely, but soon circled the point everyone wanted answered. A reporter from the Tribune raised his hand, voice clear through the mic. "Do you want the police to apologize?" The question sliced the air, straight into the crowd's expectation for a reaction, anger, outrage, or at least a statement of resistance. Raina lifted her head and looked directly at the reporter, not with defiance, not with pain, just a gaze, clear and bright, as if she were reflecting the question back with double its weight. She answered, "I don't need an apology. I need a system where people like me don't have to become evidence before they start fixing the law." The grip on every recorder tightened. A few mics slipped from hands that relaxed involuntarily. No one had prepared for that answer. It didn't sound like a victim seeking healing, it was a declaration clearing the table where justice had long been used as a weapon. Raina didn't say more. She stood silent, letting everyone feel the weight of her words in the space left by that stillness, where even the shaking camera lenses caught the shift like aftershocks from confirmed data. There was no more denying it. MALIK stood one step behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on her back. He didn't speak. His presence was enough to bear witness to what she had just said, that a woman like her didn't need to be apologized to, because what needed changing wasn't grammar, it was the structure of power. Another reporter, this one from a local television station, seemed to tremble slightly, perhaps because he, too, had once believed in simplified headlines. He asked, "Then what do you want from the public?" Raina turned to him, this time without flinching. "I want people to understand I'm not a special case. I'm just someone who has a husband who knows his rights, and a camera caught the right moment. What about those who have neither? The question hung in the air unanswered, because everyone understood that part was never listed in justice reports. Camera angles shifted back, live streams kept rolling, but the comments began to change, from shock to unease, from sympathy to scrutiny. She didn't chant slogans, didn't demand compensation, didn't recount where she was touched or what was yelled at her. She came to correct the structure of a sentence society had written out of order, that a person's existence should never be used to test the ego of a badge and a gun. When the press briefing ended, she turned and walked away. No wave, no glance back. Malik followed, hands still in his pockets, saying nothing. The two turned down a narrow side street, out of view from any cameras. But the moment she said, "I don't need an apology," had already been saved to countless hard drives, not because it was a political statement, but because it was the way someone stood up, not to demand justice for herself, but to ask the rest of the world, what about the ones without cameras? And in that question, the crowd fell silent, not because they didn't have an answer, but because they already did, and could no longer look away. Raina answered in an even tone, her gaze unwavering. They don't need to say anything. They need to change how they see before they speak. What seemed like a simple response echoed like an explosion through the walls of long-standing bias within the justice system. It wasn't an attack nor a demand for atonement, but a direct strike against the habit of apologizing to escape accountability, where people believe a soft word can erase the weight of a violent act. Standing in the press circle, Raina didn't retreat, didn't justify, didn't emphasize right or wrong. She simply pointed to the flaw, the distorted lens that had led an entire chain of misconduct, beginning with suspicion at the sight of a black woman standing on her own front steps, and ending with a bouquet on the pavement. In that moment, no camera needed to zoom or adjust audio. The message was unmistakable. The system doesn't need to learn how to apologize. It needs to relearn how to see people. Within an hour of the live stream on Platform X and national television channels, the clip featuring her line, "They need to change how they see before they speak," had been cut, set to lo-fi or hip-hop beats, and turned into the soundtrack of a growing wave of protest videos across social media. On TikTok, reenactments of racial bias from traffic stops to store checkouts used Raina's words as the quiet, shattering conclusion to each clip. Community organizers, black mothers, veterans, and law students began recreating the moment not just to spread the message, but to affirm this truth. Resistance doesn't always come from a scream. Sometimes, it comes from one decisive sentence enough to drown out layers of false language the system once used to justify misused power. On Instagram, a reel with Raina's voice layered over music passed 1 million views in 8 hours, showing only images of women who had spoken up but were ignored. The caption read, "They didn't yell, they weren't heard. She spoke once. Now the world listens." Comments shifted by region and language, but carried a shared emotion, awakening. Many wrote that they never imagined such a quiet statement could hit so hard, because it reached a place few words ever touch. The understanding that change doesn't come from scripted apologies, but from people learning to see others with eyes stripped of fear and bias. Accounts that had stayed silent on similar incidents began reposting the clip with one line, "This isn't a trend, this is a mirror." Lo, and in the 24 hours that followed, hundreds of grassroots organizations across the United States began using that same quote to launch new campaigns. One group in Atlanta replaced its homepage description with, "We don't ask for apologies. We ask for a new lens." In a high school civics class in Missouri, a teacher played the clip for students and asked, "If you were the officer that day, what would you have seen?" The class fell silent, not from lack of answers, but because, for the first time, they were being taught to look, not to react. And so, a sentence that wasn't a slogan, didn't chant or shout, became the sharpest turning point in a cascade of upheaval, where resistance needed no volume, only the right moment, the right voice, and the right person willing to speak. 2 weeks after the incident, in the third-floor briefing room of the city police headquarters usually reserved for roll calls and internal patrol strategy meetings, the air had tightened like steel wire under a layer of forced silence. Brenner submitted his resignation early that morning, gave no explanation, and requested no transfer. The paper was left on the HR chief's desk, signature dry and deliberate, strokes bold and steady like they'd been shaped by hundreds of case reports. But this time, There was nothing left to defend. Harper had no choice at all. The prosecution file was delivered directly from the state attorney's office, with 2 charges: violation of civil rights and obstruction of legal process. Either charge, if convicted, would end any chance of re-entry into any law enforcement agency on federal soil. Officers who once worked shifts beside them now sat in the same room, but no one looked up. Every eye dropped to the wood grain of the conference table, as if it carried the weight of the shame the entire unit now shared. On the whiteboard behind them, the shift supervisor had written, "Protocol for residents with military linkage mandatory retraining." No one objected, no one joked. Whatever sarcastic remarks had lingered in their throats had vanished the day Raina walked out of the station, without needing anyone to argue on her behalf. In the room where orders used to be issued and authority reinforced, now remained only the echo of a lesson never covered in the academy curriculum. A young officer, maybe not yet 30, usually just a supporting figure on patrols, spoke when asked what he'd learned. "What did I learn? That the silence of one person can be enough to crush the shout of an entire force." The room held its breath, not because it was profound, but because it was true. It captured the burn each of them felt when watching that clip broadcast millions of times, where Raina didn't struggle, didn't scream for help, didn't accuse. She only looked, and that look peeled away the outer shell of a unit's belief structure. Another quietly added, "And I learned that when we assume we are just, we can forget that true justice doesn't need to introduce itself." No one clapped, but no one stopped the sentence from repeating in their heads. A new notice had been pinned to the door. All officers must complete unconscious bias awareness training within 45 days. Below that bold directive was the small insignia of the Civil Military Coordination Unit, something that had never appeared in any of Jefferson Station's paperwork before. Its presence signaled that this wasn't just an internal adjustment. The entire system was beginning to recalibrate the definition of responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to understand it, understand people, and understand the weight of every response issued. The briefing adjourned, but that sentence didn't leave the room. The silence of one person can crush the shout of a force. Some would write it in their notebooks, some would carry it quietly during patrol, and some maybe would use it to stop themselves before shouting at someone just for standing tall. Because clearly, this lesson didn't come from weapons, rank, or orders. It came from a woman who didn't scream, didn't present evidence, and still made the entire system bow its head and rewrite its code of conduct. The new police chief was sworn in on Monday morning, in a ceremony without ribbons, no bugles, only a worn wooden table, and a reform pledge printed with the first 3 lines in bold. Retrain the entire force on protocols for engaging multi-ethnic communities. Ensure every interaction begins with understanding, not command. His signature sat at the bottom, the penstroke simple but firm, as if closing the bitter legacy of the previous term. The press didn't crowd in, reporters jotted down a few notes. But the more telling moment came the next morning, when a maintenance worker quietly set up a ladder and rehung the department's old motto outside the precinct: "To protect and serve." Once carved in bold relief, the phrase had, over the years and amid controversies, come to feel like an empty slogan. This time, they repainted it, gold outline over a deep blue background, right above the main entrance. No banners, no flags. Strangely, no one passing by stopped to take a photo, not because they didn't care, but because they weren't ready to believe. The phrase had once stood for law enforcement's promise to the community, but after too many abuses of power, it now sounded like an apology repeated too often, familiar, but no longer felt. People passed by, glanced up, and kept walking, as if waiting for something more real, a specific action, a system that actually changes. A day when, to protect and serve doesn't need to be hung high as a reminder, but can be seen in the way an officer asks instead of orders, stands beside rather than above. And somewhere in the way no one stopped for photos was a cold but honest signal. Honor cannot be self-declared, it must be proven. One case, one action, one person at a time. The new chief watched that reaction from behind his office glass, didn't frown, didn't look discouraged. He nodded slightly, then turned to begin the first district-wide meeting on communication protocols. For him, the lack of photos was the clearest sign that people weren't looking for symbols, they were looking for behavior. A woman pushing a stroller past the precinct that day paused for a few seconds to look up at the repainted phrase, then bent down to tuck the blanket back over her child. She didn't take out her phone, but when asked that evening, she told her husband, "I saw they put the motto back up, but to believe it, they've got more to fix than just a sign." And that was the shared feeling of many who had followed the Raina Cole story from beginning to end. They weren't waiting for it to close with a reform announcement. They wanted to see how long that reform would hold, how much it could withstand, and whether it would truly change how an officer sees another person not as a subject to control, but as an equal citizen. So the phrase, "to protect and serve," may be back on the wall, but to the people walking past, it has only just begun to answer for itself. And this time, no one is quick to believe a declaration. They need time, and the system, if it hopes to preserve what trust remains, will have to learn how to work quietly, instead of praising itself loudly. In the dim space of the military data station buried deep underground, where the blue glow of monitors lit every wall and the only sound was keystrokes tapping in sequence, a senior security analyst quietly logged the Jefferson incident into the system. She sat upright, hands steady, though her eyes held the weight of someone aware she was entering a pivot point, not just in events, but in something deeper. The file code auto-generated, civil incident affecting strategic personnel. Below the classification line, the system prompted its default question, severity level? Her hand paused half a second, then selected from a list that included emergency, internal security, public perception, and finally, strategic communications. She clicked it without blinking, as if it had been predetermined, not because the case threatened military security, but because it marked a rare moment when a connected individual became the catalyst for a society to re-examine the foundation of its own trust. Marking the case as strategic communications wasn't a procedural move. It was an implicit declaration that this was no longer a local jurisdiction's matter, but a blueprint requiring information, reaction, and influence control. The analyst was no stranger to social behavior algorithms. Similar cases in the past had been tagged civic behavioral crisis or localized abuse of power, but Jefferson no longer fit those boxes. This was when the system recognized that it wasn't just a story about an officer and a civilian, but a collision of military honor, institutional face, and a long unmet hunger for justice. When Raina Cole didn't yell, didn't resist, but still forced a nation to talk about how a person is seen not for what they do, but simply for existing, it stopped being a legal case. It became a societal test. She saved the log, sat a few minutes longer as the system synced with the Fort Liberty server. The secondary screen is populated with auxiliary signals, dozens of articles, academic commentary, and nonprofit media campaigns adopting Raina's image as a symbol. Policy psychologists began drafting new training modules for law enforcement. Even a National Defense Center proposed adding the Jefferson scenario to federal civil response curricula. No one mandated it, no one issued orders, but clearly, everyone understood. From now on, every officer's gaze on a civilian would carry the memory of a woman in a green dress, standing at her front door, pushed to the ground, still looking straight ahead. The analyst exhaled slowly and closed the laptop. The file had been saved. No backup was needed, because when something reaches that deep into public consciousness, it doesn't need reminders to be remembered. And the most unsettling thing for any system isn't the person who says too much. It's the one who stays silent at the right moment, and everyone has to listen. Under the dim lights of the data room, where every line of code was encrypted beyond visibility, yet every decision reached the deepest layers of national strategy, the senior security analyst remained seated, eyes fixed on the dialog box glowing on her screen. The system's final prompt appeared, "Name the event," a question that seemed procedural, but within intelligence circles, a code name isn't for memory, it's a warning. A code name echoes through strategic briefings, social risk assessments, and closed-door training sessions the public will never hear of. She didn't need long. Her fingers moved across the keys, each letter appearing in sequence. Raina Protocol, activated by silence. 6 words, no more, but enough to make anyone who understands the logic of power stop and reconsider. The name didn't describe violence, didn't imply crisis. It wasn't the label of a case, a location, or a military campaign. It was a principle, a new one of its time, a principle where silence is no longer seen as weakness or passivity, but as the most precise form of assault, because it forces every system to interpret its own behavior. This wasn't war. There were no march orders, no tactical maps, no combat formations. And because of that, the warning landed more sharply than any directive ever could. One person, without threats or slogans, had made an entire system retreat, and the system, if it wanted to endure, had no choice but to acknowledge that, not with force, but by rewriting its own definitions of threat and presence. The logging command was confirmed. The final status displayed. Protocol accepted. Risk flag enabled. Tier 4 dissemination. She nodded, then exited the interface, leaving behind a file that seemed small but would become the foundation for future directives. When encountering a civilian, exhibiting extreme silence under legal pressure, it must no longer be classified as non-compliant behavior, but as strategic, active response. Because after Jefferson, no one would dare underestimate a woman who said 7 words and flipped a nation's entire hashtag momentum. From now on, RAINA Protocol wouldn't be a name. It would be a framework, a signal system warning that some people, even when standing alone on concrete, can force the entire order to reconfigure itself. As the screen faded to black, the room fell into stillness just as it was built to operate. No alarms, no flashing lights, only people working in the shadows to steer a country where even the slightest deviation could fracture the social crust. And on the lowest floor of that data center, where power moved more quietly than any legislative chamber, one woman's name had just become the new benchmark for measuring the reflexes of a legal system not by how it reacts, but by how long it pauses after a single look. This is how a new era begins, not with a gun, but with 6 words. Not through loss, but through a collective memory that refuses to fade. RAINA Protocol, activated by silence, and no one dares pretend they don't understand. On a soft morning lit by thin sunlight, RAINA stood at the threshold of her home, sleeves of her white shirt darkened from watering the plants, hair tied neatly behind her head. The letter wasn't delivered by mail, just placed gently at the doorstep, folded in 4, the handwriting on the outside slightly trembling. She bent down to pick it up, opened it with both hands, and read slowly, as if afraid to miss any meaning in the still fresh ink. "I am Officer Brenner's mother," it began. "I once believed I'd taught my son enough about right and wrong, about how to see people beyond the color of their skin. But what he did to you showed me I only taught him how to survive, not how to be a person. Today, I'm not apologizing for him. I'm asking to learn from you, if you'll allow it." There was no formal sign-off, no return address, just one line at the end. A mother rethinking how she loved her son. RAINA read to that point, paused, eyes steady. She didn't cry, didn't overreact, just took a deep breath and read it again, once, then twice more. Each reading unraveled another knot inside, not because the letter excused anything, but because it dared to admit what the system always avoided. Responsibility doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it starts with a mother. MALIK stepped out from inside, a cup of ginger tea in hand. Seeing her gaze still and quiet, he didn't ask. He placed a hand on her shoulder, light enough to be present without intrusion. RAINA still held the letter, folding it carefully, like she was tucking away a piece of time newly rewritten. She spoke softly, only for MALIK to hear, "I forgive, but I don't forget." That sentence wasn't meant for the letter. It was for every fragmented memory scattered across the past days. Forgive because someone was brave enough to face their fault without defense. Don't forget, because this cannot become something that slides by. RAINA didn't need anyone punished on her behalf, nor did she ask for a public apology. She chose to keep a quiet space where she could manage the memory neither as a burden nor as something erased. A mature forgiveness, not to lighten someone else's conscience, but so she herself no longer had to brace against the ignorance of those who refused to learn. MALIK heard her words and nodded, not to respond, but to affirm. In that shared silence, they stepped back inside, leaving the letter resting on the wooden table by the window where sunlight kept streaming in each morning like a reminder. Some mistakes don't need punishment, only to be remembered long enough not to repeat. Outside, the trees had just begun to turn, a new season on the way. She knew there would be more letters unwritten, more apologies that lived only in people's hearts, never sent. But that single line from the mother was enough to show. Not everyone chooses silence, and not everyone inside the system wants to stay on the wrong side. Change doesn't begin with policy memos or public statements, but in how each person faces themselves, honest enough to admit, humble enough to relearn. And sometimes, like this morning, one small handwritten note is enough to close a whole chain of wounds without any blood being shed. RAINA didn't bring it up again, but in her eyes, the story had turned a page where rage was replaced by boundaries, and memory was no longer a wound, but a guide. Out on the street, the steady sound of a child's bicycle rolled across the brick pavement, accompanied by soft conversations. A girl around 7, wearing an owl-shaped backpack, walked while looking up at a house with a white fence and large windows, where the light was always just enough to see inside a woman of color standing by a bookshelf, a tall man making coffee. The girl tugged on her mother's hand and pointed at the house. "Mom, is that the lady who got arrested by the police?" The mother didn't look right away, just slowed her steps and answered with an even breath. "She's the reason you can stand tall when someone tells you to bow." The words fell on the sidewalk like a shard of glass, reflecting a truth never taught in school, that not everyone who gets pulled down is a victim. Some people, once forced to the ground, rise and become the reason others can hold their heads high. The child walked in silence for a few steps. She was not old enough to understand the full story, had never read Raina Cole's name in the news, or seen it on social media, but she was sensitive enough to sense that something unusual lived in her mother's words. Instead of shielding her from sensitive images, the mother chose to teach her that sometimes the world isn't split into clear right and wrong, but still, there are people who choose what's right amid doubt. And those people, whether once labeled criminals, handcuffed, or thrown to the ground, are the ones worth learning from, not avoiding. The girl asked nothing more. She simply looked up at the house again, not with curiosity this time, but with the kind of gaze that commits something to memory. Maybe one day, she'll grow up and forget the name that once stirred a nation, but she'll never forget the moment her mother taught her to stand tall because a woman once refused to bow. Inside the house, Raina saw the mother and daughter through the edge of the window, her eyes meeting the girl's just as she turned away. No one smiled, no one waved, but the silence between them was clear enough. Both sides understood something had been exchanged, not in words, but in continuity. Malik stood behind Raina, resting his hand lightly on the table, and asked, "What was that?" She shook her head gently. "Just, someone saw." Malik didn't ask more. For him, one person seeing without turning away was enough. From the beginning, Raina had never wanted fame, never sought titles, and certainly never needed anyone to call her a symbol. All she ever wanted was for the world to stop hurting people like her, simply for having the courage to exist. And on that morning, when a child was told, "She's the reason you can stand tall," what Raina wanted had begun to take form. It wasn't in the revised laws or bullet points on post-incident reports. It was something recorded through memory, quietly embedded into the heart of a new generation, so that one day, when that very child grows up and stands before another injustice, maybe she won't scream or hold a sign, but she'll remember that someone once stayed silent, was forced to kneel, then stood up and stared into disdain without blinking. And when she stands tall, the world will begin to change again, not with a shout, but with one right act, at the right time. Like Raina. The classroom lights were on, the digital board behind displaying the headline, "Retraining Program, Identifying and Dismantling Law Enforcement Bias." Every seat was filled, mostly with officer trainees from different states, some just a few months into learning how to use handcuffs, others lieutenants on the path to becoming regional commanders. Raina entered as a guest speaker, carrying no documents or presentation slides, just a gray button-up shirt, a few creases at the sleeves, and an unwavering gaze. She didn't speak of herself as a victim. She didn't recount the incident in detail. She opened with this: "I'm here because some people once chose to see me as a threat. The question is, after today, what will you choose to see in others?" No one laughed. No one looked away. No one rushed to take notes. That question made every person pause, not to answer it, but to ask themselves if they had ever looked at someone through that same outdated lens. An hour passed as Raina walked them through scenarios, different ways to respond, and the subtle collisions between maintaining public order and violating human dignity. She didn't lecture, she guided. Each example wasn't about right or wrong, it was designed to force the audience to recognize themselves within the situations. Because the line between doing your duty and overstepping it often lies in attitude, not the law. Near the end, she paused, took a sip of water, and prepared to leave the podium when a hand went up. A young officer, face tense, eyes a mix of respect and confusion, spoke. "Were you scared? When they held your arms? When they shouted in your face? When they called you a threat?" The room froze. No one expected that question, but no one stopped it either. Raina looked directly at the officer, her expression neither accusatory nor patronizing. She answered quietly but clearly, I was afraid of one thing only, that those entrusted with the power over life and death would believe they didn't need to understand others. The room went completely silent. Then she continued, "Fear doesn't come from commands or weapons. It comes from the moment you realize they don't see you as a person but as a threat because of your skin color, your silence, your refusal to fall. That kind of fear is what keeps a broken system going, because it's born from trust being misused." She stopped there, needing no more words. What needed to be taught was already in her voice, her face, and that's something no textbook can print. When Raina left the classroom, no one stood to see her off. There was no applause like with most guest lectures, but many eyes followed her. Some furrowed brows, some quietly took notes of everything she had just said, and some for the first time looked at the badge on their chest as if to ask themselves, "Who will I use this for?" She didn't look back, but her steps were lighter leaving than when she arrived, because a real question had been asked, and sometimes, a single honest question, asked at the right moment, is enough to shift an entire generation of officers trained to act with reason, but reminded that the heart is also a weapon, and fear, when examined carefully, doesn't have to be a barrier. It can become the reason to act with more humanity. Raina didn't stop at her initial answer. She looked directly at the cadet who had asked the question, then scanned the room before continuing, "Fear is normal. As human beings, we all have the right to feel anxious, uneasy in the face of authority, or when we don't know what's coming next. But fear doesn't mean silence. Speaking up despite fear is courage. Staying true despite fear is strength." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, each word etched into the walls of a classroom now unusually still. The air felt heavier because everyone sitting below knew that statement wasn't just for those who had ever been oppressed, but also for them, the ones in uniform, the ones with decision-making power, the ones learning how not to let fear distort their moral compass. She left the podium after that, without looking back, leaving behind a classroom quieter than it had ever been. Less than an hour later, a recording of her talk began circulating on the internal network used by instructors and trainees within the Federal Officer Training System. But then, an account labeled Instructor Ethics clipped a 22-second segment where Raina said, "Fear doesn't mean silence," adding the caption, "If we were all taught this before stepping into the streets, there might be less blood on America's sidewalks." The clip was quickly re-edited with scenes from Raina's incident, the moment she was handcuffed, the moment Malik entered the precinct, the moment they looked at each other without speaking, all revolving around one axis: unwavering composure. Within 48 hours, the video surpassed 3 million views, not just among law enforcement but also in law schools, human rights groups, and notably, military forums. One pinned comment stood out: "Some lessons take a generation to relearn." She taught it in one sentence. None of those who had once attacked Raina dared to speak against her, because she didn't accuse anyone, didn't denounce the system, didn't name names or turn herself into a banner. She spoke only about fear, the kind that lives in every person, civilian or cop, and how the way we face it determines whether we protect what's right or crush it. That's why the clip didn't become a protest video, it became a moral lesson. Those who once doubted her, who once said she was performing in her silence, now had to admit that a woman doesn't have to shout to be heard. She only has to speak the truth, and let that truth reach the human part of each person, wearing a uniform in the name of justice. Without signing a single executive order, without appearing on any magazine cover, Raina still made an entire system ask itself, what are we teaching those we give power to? And within those same 48 hours, many young officers began requesting extra training in ethical conduct, not out of obligation, but because, for the first time, they understood that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing might make them part of it. Raina didn't return to talk shows or launch a media campaign. She went back to her old house, watered the plants, and when someone asked why she chose to live quietly, she simply smiled and replied, "Because I said what needed to be said. Now it's someone else's turn to do what needs to be done." And that statement, simple to the point of being ruthless, continued to echo through millions of replays, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Morning light filtered through the small window of a roadside cafe in Texas, where the clink of spoons against glasses blended with the low hum of the morning news from an old television mounted in the corner. A young man in plain clothes ordered coffee while flipping through the front page of the local paper. Raina Cole's image appeared on the cover. Under the headline, "The Woman Who Made Law Enforcement Rethink How They See Citizens." He paused there longer than usual, eyes unblinking. The article didn't detail the incident, just quoted her statement from the federal classroom, "Fear doesn't mean silence." His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, then slowly folded it and placed it on the dark wooden table. He didn't speak to anyone, just took one last sip of unfinished coffee and left the cafe. In his patrol car, he checked his weapon like every other day, adjusted the radio, and started the engine. The roads were quiet, the outskirts peaceful, just a few elderly people walking, and the sound of a dog barking from a nearby fence. At the southern intersection, he saw a black woman standing in front of a cream-colored house, fumbling with her keys at the front door. She wore a knee-length dress, hair tied high, posture hurried but not careless. A familiar scene, repeated thousands of times in a police officer's life, where one has to decide quickly, is this a resident or someone trying to break in? He stopped the car, stepped out, eyes fixed on her. In that moment, every trained reflex kicked in like a script. Verify, approach, maintain distance, prepare to intervene. But instead of blurting out the usual cold inquiry, he stood still for 3 seconds. The woman turned and met his gaze, neither startled nor evasive. She raised her hand slightly, as if to show she had nothing to hide, but said nothing. And in that split second, the memory from the cafe returned Raina's face on the paper. That sentence, her steady eyes when confronted with bias. The young officer didn't ask for ID, didn't ask whose house it was, didn't reach for his holster out of habit. He simply gave a slight nod and said something he hadn't expected. "Do you need me to hold the door while you unlock it?" The woman looked briefly surprised, then smiled. "Thanks. I've got it." He didn't walk away immediately. He watched for a few more seconds to make sure she got inside safely, then turned to leave, no card left behind, no words added. On the way back to the station, he kept thinking about that moment. It wasn't something he learned at the academy or read in the patrol manual. It came from knowing that with just one wrong glance, one poorly measured tone, he could become the next Brenner, dragging the entire system to the edge of rewriting laws just to apologize. And also from knowing that no one is born right, but everyone has the chance to pause even during a routine patrol and choose to do right. Not because someone orders it, but because they once saw a woman who stood tall when pushed to the ground. Raina had never met him, but that morning, she made him fold the paper and change how he looked at a person. And sometimes, that change is enough. Not loud, just in time. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, no hand on his belt, no heavy steps trying to assert authority. His eyes stayed level with the woman's, not drifting to her knees, not dropping to her waist, searching for pockets or unfamiliar objects. He kept a distance close enough to hear her voice, far enough for her to feel unthreatened. The woman was still unlocking the door, turned slightly at the sound of footsteps, not startled, not stepping back. She looked at him for a second, then smiled, her eyes reflecting observation more than fear. First time, her voice was soft, neither mocking nor naive, just a question tossed out to see whether the uniformed man had shown up protocol or for human presence. He stood still, lips pressed, eyes steady on her face, and took only one breath to respond, first time seeing clearly. The answer wasn't meant to be philosophical. It came from something real, the reality that after years of being trained to react fast, resolve clean, he had forgotten that most people standing at their front door were simply trying to go home. For the first time, he saw that without checking a guidebook, without defaulting to skin color, voice, or posture. His words made her smile grow slightly wider, but she didn't reply, just nodded as a gesture of acknowledgement and turned back to her door. The whole thing lasted under a minute. No officer shouting, no cuffs clicking, no one shoved onto cold pavement or dragged through a system they never understood why they entered. He walked back to his car without logging anything into the patrol report, without calling it in, because there was no incident to report, only the simple act of stepping out of protocol and back into human behavior. And while the system still demanded paperwork and procedure, what had changed inside him that day wasn't duty, it was awareness. He didn't know her name, didn't ask, but he understood clearly that what he'd just done wasn't a favor, it was responsibility in its truest form, the kind that should have been happening all along, for everyone, everywhere, at all times. Because order doesn't come from force, it comes from trust, trust that those in power won't misuse it. And as he drove away, the moment replayed in his mind like a silent film, the woman standing there, smiling at him, neither threatened nor grateful, simply trusting that today it had gone the way it should. Maybe no one would ever recount that moment. No clip would go viral with millions of views, but to him, a young officer on a routine patrol, it was the first time he had truly seen clearly. And that didn't need proof. It just needed to happen again, every day, by people brave enough to slow down, hold the right distance, and really look, like Raina once did, and like that woman, with a small smile, carried forward. In a formal hall draped in flags, warm yellow lights fell on the front rows where veterans and their families sat in silence. Malik, in dress uniform, rested his hands on his thighs, eyes locked forward without blinking. His Delta Force uniform didn't need gleaming medals, his posture alone commanded stillness. On the raised stage, the presiding officer turned to the final page of the packet, his steady voice cutting through the silence. Special honor commendation awarded to a civilian, not for military valor, but for the integrity shown in civil resistance. The room tensed, waiting for a name no one could guess, until the officer looked up and read, clearly and without pause, Raina Cole, honored citizen for upholding dignity in the face of power distorted. No applause came immediately. No one knew how to react when someone not in uniform was named among those who had served on the battlefield. Then, from the back, a veteran stood, placed a hand over his heart, and bowed his head. Another stood, then a third, then the fourth row. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, without any command. Raina walked forward from the right side, not in a ceremonial dress, just a simple blouse and a gaze long since used to attention without seeking approval. She stepped onto the stage, hands empty. The presiding officer tilted his head to present the symbolic badge, but she didn't reach for it immediately. She looked around, then spoke not loudly, but clearly enough for every mic to catch every word. I'm not a hero. I just didn't choose silence. And sometimes, silence is the only thing that keeps dignity alive. Her words weren't grandstanding, but they made heads across the room nod instinctively. Malik remained seated, eyes on his wife, expressionless. To him, this wasn't a reward. It was proof of something they'd always believed. Composure can shift the entire outcome, and dignity doesn't need a flag to reclaim justice. When Raina stepped down, she gave a slight nod, no wave, no photos, because she knew that moment wasn't about the past, it was a marker for the future. A future where everyone, whether in power or not, would be held accountable for how they see, treat, and respond to another human being, not through race, not through status, but through basic respect. After the ceremony, there was no chatter like at other honors events. Attendees left in silence, weighed down by a renewed understanding that systemic distortion isn't just in procedures, but in every glance, every seemingly minor decision, every command issued without recognition of the person it targets. And if a woman like Raina could make an entire precinct rethink its conduct, force legal text to reword a footnote on exceptional response, then maybe anyone could start by no longer siding with silence. A badge of honor didn't change her life, but it made others aware that their own might change if they pause, listen, and truly see before acting. And maybe that's the deepest kind of recognition there is. Raina stepped onto the stage with slow but steady strides, the overhead lights of the auditorium casting her face into sharp relief, unadorned by makeup, not seeking to impress. She stopped at center stage, holding no notes, adjusting no microphone, only locking eyes with the seats below eyes that had once seen cold interrogations, moments of being forced to the ground just for standing too straight. She didn't need many words, nor did she try to stir emotion. Raina bowed her head slightly, then looked up, her gaze fixed on the front row where those with the power to sign orders, rewrite policies, and shape enforcement sat. I'm not here to be honored. I'm here to be remembered. The sentence dropped into the room like a verdict, needing no signature, no further proof, no applause to know it had hit its mark. The room stayed silent, not out of confusion, but because there was too much to think about. No one cried, but a few cheeks flushed. No one nodded, but eyes across worn, experienced faces glinted, as if they just heard something they couldn't unhear. Because when a woman who had once knelt on a sidewalk, had her wrists bound in a precinct, been questioned like a nameless shadow, now stood at the center of an honor ceremony not to be exalted, but to remind no one could walk away unmoved. Malik sat in the audience, his gaze soft, but his hand clenched lightly on his knee. He knew she hadn't said it to retaliate. She said it because too many people like her had never been remembered, never been acknowledged, and so they kept being forgotten each day. Power crossed a line and no one asked why. Raina remained a few seconds more, didn't bow, didn't raise a hand in thanks, then stepped back and left the stage as quietly as she had arrived. But the echo of those 6 words stayed, reverberating through the minds of soldiers, law enforcement officers, scholars, and lawmakers spread throughout the rows. A woman who didn't ask for honor but demanded remembrance not of her name, but of the story she stood for, the people she spoke for, and the consequences of looking away from what should never be ignored. And what moved the room wasn't her loss, it was the realization that they had all, in some way, helped allow it to happen. They didn't go silent from pity. They went silent because they knew they had stayed silent for too long. After the ceremony, as people passed one another in the hallway outside the hall, no one spoke about the medals or the video montage played earlier. They whispered instead about how she said that line, at that moment, with that look not angry, not tired, but entirely unforgiving of indifference. And though her speech lasted only 8 seconds, it was replayed thousands of times in the hours that followed, quoted in articles, screenshotted across social media, turned into a banner taped outside new training classrooms. I'm here to be remembered. 6 words, a warning, and a reminder that sometimes it's the quietest statement that stays with people the longest. 6 months after the incident, social media suddenly witnessed a new wave of shares spreading faster than the algorithm could catch. An old clip resurfaced shot from a shaky phone, blurry but breath-catchingly clear. Raina forced to the ground, 2 officers holding her down, her face pressed to the pavement, tulips scattered like a cruel metaphor for gentleness, distorted by power. The caption was simple, and she warned them, no effects, no soundtrack, just 6 words that stopped hundreds of thousands in their tracks, eyes locked on a moment they thought they'd forgotten. But right below was a new video. Raina standing in a classroom, not in a black suit, no raised podium, just a pen in hand, and her gaze locked on each uniformed trainee. The caption mirrored the first perfectly, and now, we listen. The 2 videos sat side by side in the feed, one old, one new, one a record of injustice, the other a symbol of course correction. The power wasn't in their drama, but in their truth. So real it left viewers speechless, because the shift didn't come from political declarations or media campaigns, but from the very person once seen as the victim, now becoming the one teaching the lesson that every academy should have taught long ago. The comments didn't erupt into debate or outrage, but settled into quiet acknowledgement. I thought I understood justice. Now I'm rethinking everything. She didn't change the system. She made the system change itself. Not long after, an article appeared on the homepage of a national law enforcement forum, From Reaction to Responsibility, the Raina Cole Lesson, and the Maturity of American Policing. The piece didn't glorify the individual, it broke down how a system can only retain trust if it faces its failures head-on, and if those it has harmed still have the courage to stand not for vengeance, for a reminder. Training programs slowly began to add new material, where videos weren't arrest demos, but scenarios forcing trainees to ask, if I were the officer in that clip, what would I do differently? And Raina stopped being framed as a symbol. She became a benchmark, marking the moment collective awareness shifted. A modest hashtag began to surface across professional forums, number Raina Standard. It didn't go viral in a mainstream sense, but quietly spread among captains, supervisors, and training curricula. The Raina Standard wasn't defined by rigid rules, but by a prompt. Before you act, pause for 1 second to ask if you're reacting by habit or responding with intent. No system is flawless, but those upholding it can choose whether to repeat bias or break it. And if a woman once pinned to the ground still chose to speak, what excuse do those in power have to remain silent? No one referred to the incident as a stain anymore. It had become a moment, a marker, a turning point in how a society examined itself. And Raina, once misnamed in reports, was now written in full in training manuals. Raina Cole, an example of resistance not through shouting, through an unshaken existence. That's how history is made, not with a gunshot, but with 2 videos. One was humiliation, one was a lesson, and neither could be watched without facing them, because now they know she warned them, and now it's time to listen. No more visual effects, no hashtag crawling across the bottom of the screen, no slogans or symbols of resistance. Just an old clip replayed, a black woman forced down on the pavement, her hand clutching a broken tulip petal, eyes dry, not fighting back. The clip was shared by someone not famous, not an activist, not affiliated with any organization. The caption was chilling in its simplicity. Some people fight with guns. She fought with stillness. The line needed no explanation, no context. It cut through the chest like a quiet blade. making viewers hesitate before hitting share, staring at the screen for a few more seconds not because of the image, but because of the silence inside it. Raina never launched a movement, never made herself a slogan, never allowed her image to be commercialized into a brand of protest. She existed like a period in a sentence full of exclamation points, and that quietness made everything around her louder. In the first months after the incident, people expected her to become a movement leader, a new face for racial justice, a figure on raised banners. But Raina just went to teach, to speak, to retell her unsensational story in a steady voice, no emphasis needed. She didn't dramatize the past, didn't restage her arrest to provoke tears, didn't paint herself as a grand victim, and because of that, people couldn't look away. Malik didn't appear on television after that day either. He returned to his unit, to training, to a job where silence is a rule of survival. They never chanted slogans, never went on speaking tours together, but their story became required reading in police academies, in law classrooms, in training modules for diverse districts, not because they wanted it, but because the system couldn't keep teaching the same way after someone who was once forced to kneel walked into it and rewrote the script line by line. And no one could talk about risk management without referencing Raina's silent nod on national television. That stillness, in its own way, echoed louder than any official statement. Underneath that video and caption, thousands hit like without adding a word. Some added just a period. Some wrote, "Read again." No debates, no rants against the police, no angry screaming. Because somehow, in the end, what moved people wasn't shouting. It was the image of a woman, hands twisted behind her back in broad daylight, who still kept her spine straight, as if no one had ever touched her. That was a form of fighting. No weapons, no retaliation. No need for victory, just enough stillness to make others realize they were playing the wrong part. And so, 6 months, a year, many years later, that clip kept getting shared. No campaigns, no pay, no anniversaries, just the quiet belief that a new generation needed to see that someone once fought by not stepping back, not screaming, not striking back, just standing, staring, and forcing an entire system to retreat. Stillness, it turns out, is the one language that cannot be twisted. Raina spoke it to remind people that sometimes standing still isn't submission. It's the final warning, wrapped in the quietest, most terrifying silence of a person who knows, without doubt, that they are right. Raina Cole had once been forced to the pavement, her hand gripping a crushed tulip petal, under the cold eyes of 2 officers who believed their uniforms could replace reason. She didn't scream, didn't resist, just spoke one sentence that made the whole country stop. "Touch me again, and my husband will ruin you." They thought she was bluffing. But then, from the parking lot of the police station, Malik Cole, a Delta Force commander, walked in. No shouting, no weapons drawn, just one sentence left behind. "Release my wife, or you'll answer to a court no one survives." That wasn't a threat. It was reality. The reality that those who abuse power never imagine they'll face when their violence collides with the final limit. A woman who knows her worth, and a husband who knows exactly when to stay silent and when to break every calm to demand justice. The story didn't end with action or authority. What made it unforgettable was how Raina chose to face the aftermath not with vengeance, but with leadership. She didn't become a figure of revenge, nor did she allow herself to be turned into a hollow symbol. She appeared in classrooms, stepped onto podiums, and told those training law enforcement, silence isn't weakness, it's the careful choosing of a voice, so that when it's used, it cuts sharp enough not to get lost in the noise. Malik didn't appear as a hero either. He returned to his unit, kept protecting the country from the shadows, just as he was trained. But in this incident, he stepped into the light only to protect one person, and that alone was enough to make an entire state rewrite its enforcement protocols. The lesson didn't come from fame or share counts. It came from how an entire society had to pause, re-examine what they had long accepted as by the book, and realize that between theory and reality, between authority and justice, the gap can be bridged by a single careless act or by one glance that doesn't look down. Raina never asked for an apology, because she knew no apology could undo harm. What she demanded was a shift in awareness, that young officers facing someone like her would stop and ask themselves, am I reacting to race, to gender, or to an actual threat? And that single question is already a beginning one that previous generations never dared to approach. If there's one reason people couldn't look away, It wasn't Malik's stance or Raina's voice, but the quiet shift from victim to subject, from being targeted to being the reason a system must recalibrate. From a black woman restrained in front of her own home, Raina is now part of police training curricula, cited in strategic communication programs for the military. No one awarded her a title, no statue was raised, but every look, every sentence, every lesson drawn from her has seeped into the system in a way that can't be erased. And if this story must end with one truth, it's this: justice doesn't come from the louder voice, the greater force, or the higher rank. It comes from standing still when everyone expects you to kneel, from saying what must be said when silence is advised, and from letting your decency be the last thing left after all resistance. Raina never asked to change the world. She just refused to let the old one keep repeating its mistakes. And sometimes, that is the most profound, most lasting kind of change, requiring no slogans, only someone brave enough not to become a silent victim.